The wind did not howl. It shrieked, like heavy canvas being ripped apart down the center. By midnight on February 11th, 1899, the temperature across the Montana Territory had plummeted to 42 degrees below zero. This was not the standard winter cold that simply bit at the nose or numbed the fingers. This was a deep, structural freeze, the kind of atmospheric violence that caused iron nails to violently pop from the siding of houses, sounding like distant pistol shots in the dark. In the burgeoning timber town of Blackwood, survival was supposedly a matter of architecture and commerce. The men who had built their homes with imported milled lumber, heavily mortared fieldstone fireplaces, and thick shingled roofs were currently fighting a losing battle against the immutable laws of thermodynamics. Inside the grandest cabin in town, owned by the local lumber merchant, the massive hearth was roaring with dry split oak, throwing off enough radiant heat to scorch a man's eyebrows. Yet, just 12 feet away from the fire, water left in a tin basin had frozen solid. The residents were trapped in a cruel physical paradox. The very fireplaces they relied upon were betraying them. A massive fire requires massive amounts of oxygen, and as the heat roared up the tall stone chimneys, it created a powerful vacuum, violently sucking the -40-degree air through every microscopic seam, keyhole, and floorboard crevice in the house. They were not warming their homes. They were merely powering a wind tunnel of freezing drafts. The people of Blackwood were huddled under layers of heavy, damp wool, exhausted, watching the frost literally climb the inside of their glass windows, measuring their survival in hours and the dwindling stacks of firewood. 2 miles away, on a barren stretch of wind-scoured prairie, there was no cabin. There was no smoke rising into the black, violent sky. There were no desperate men feeding logs into a hungry fire. There was only a slight rectangular mound of snow, nearly indistinguishable from the natural rolling drifts of the plains. Beneath that snow, beneath 18 inches of densely packed frozen earth, the world was entirely different. Down in the absolute deadening silence of the soil, 32-year-old Helena Bjornson sat quietly by the soft yellow light of a single kerosene lantern. She was not wearing a heavy winter coat. She wore a simple patched cotton dress. Beside her, resting on a mattress of dried prairie grass elevated on pine crates, her 2 young children were fast asleep. They were not shivering. They were barely covered by a single thin wool blanket. The walls around them were not milled lumber or mortared stone. They were raw, vertical cuts of dense clay and soil, supported by a few scavenged, rough-hewn posts. It was a space measuring exactly 10 feet long, 8 feet wide, and 6 feet deep. On the dirt wall, a simple mercury thermometer, salvaged from a broken mercantile shipment, held remarkably steady at 68 degrees Fahrenheit. While the town above tore itself apart fighting the cold, Helena had simply stepped out of its way. She had built a geothermal heat trap. They had watched her dig this trench 6 months earlier. They had mocked her blistered, bleeding hands. They said she was digging her own grave. They were wrong. If you believe that practical wisdom and an understanding of nature's brutal realities matter more than empty certainty and expensive illusions, take a moment to subscribe. History is rarely kind to those who rely only on what they can buy, but it leaves a clear path for those who know how to prepare. The story of the geothermal dugout begins in the dusty, unforgiving heat of the previous September. Helena Bjornson had arrived in Blackwood with 2 children, a canvas sack of clothing, and exactly $43 to her name. She was a recent widow, her husband having been claimed by a sudden, violent fever during the long wagon journey westward. She possessed no horses, no livestock, and no means to generate a meaningful income before the frost set in. In the late 19th century, timber in a boomtown was a premium commodity. The cheapest unpeeled pine logs required to build even a modest, drafty, one-room surface cabin would cost upwards of $100. Milled lumber was entirely out of the question. To survive a Montana winter, convention dictated that you needed a solid wooden structure above ground, a stone hearth, and at least 6 cords of seasoned firewood. Helena had none of these, nor the physical capacity to fell and haul massive trees by herself. What she did have was a Swedish steel shovel, a painfully clear memory, and an absolute lack of pride when it came to the survival of her children. She remembered the stories her grandfather told of the severe famines in the old country and the temporary earth cellars that desperate families carved into the hillsides. But Helena possessed a sharper mind than simply copying an act of desperation. She understood a fundamental principle of the earth that the town's wealthy builders ignored in their quest for imposing tall structures. Above ground, the air is a chaotic, aggressive thief. It actively seeks to steal heat through convection. But below the frost line, about 4 feet deep in that region, the earth is a massive, silent battery. Once you dig below the surface layer affected by the sun and the snow, the deep soil maintains a constant, unchanging temperature of approximately 50 degrees Fahrenheit year-round. It is nature's own thermal baseline. Helena realized that if she built a house above ground, she would have to fight the temperature difference between negative 40 degrees and positive 65 degrees, a massive deficit of over 100 degrees that had to be conquered with constant, exhausting labor and endless cords of wood. But if she moved her living space completely beneath the earth, she only had to bridge the gap between the soil's natural 50 degrees and a comfortable 65. It was a mathematical reduction of the survival problem. She did not need to fight the winter. She only needed to heat a tiny, perfectly sealed pocket of 50-degree air. The labor began on the second Tuesday of September. The prairie soil was practically cemented together with dense root systems and heavy clay. She marked out a rectangle, strictly limiting the footprint to 10 by 8 feet. Any larger, and the space would require too much energy to heat. Any smaller, and the psychological weight of the confinement would become unbearable. She drove the steel blade of the shovel into the earth, throwing the dirt slightly away from the edge to create a raised berm. It was during the second week of this agonizing labor that the first of the skeptics arrived. Elias Thorne, the owner of the General Mercantile, drove his wagon out to her plot. He was a pragmatist, a man who measured the world in calories, coins, and tangible assets. He stood on the edge of the pit, looking down at Helena, who was coated in a thick layer of grey dust, her hands wrapped in ragged cloth to protect bursting blisters. He pointed out the sheer, terrifying arithmetic of what she was attempting. He calculated that she was moving upwards of 20 cubic yards of heavy earth by hand, an estimated 30 tons of dirt. He told her that a human body has only so much fuel to burn before the winter arrives. He argued that she was expending the vital energy she would need to survive the coming months, just to carve a hole in the mud. He told her she would be better off spending those calories cutting whatever scrub brush she could find and building a lean-to against the town's livery stable. To him, the dugout was a catastrophic misallocation of physical resources. Helena did not stop digging. She merely nodded politely, waited for his wagon wheels to turn back toward town, and drove the shovel back into the clay. She knew that the calories spent now were an investment that would pay dividends in absolute stillness later. By October, the pit was 4 feet deep, and the exhaustion was deep in her marrow. Her shoulders ached with a constant dull fire. It was then that Mr. Vance, the town's premier cabin builder, rode by. Vance was a man of the modern era, an expert in joists, pitches, and the supposed superiority of the American hearth. He dismounted, walking the perimeter of her excavation with a look of genuine professional pity. He explained the physics of cold as he understood them. He lectured her on radiant heat. He confidently stated that a fire requires a massive upward draft to draw the smoke away, and without a tall stone chimney, any fire she built in a hole would simply suffocate her. Furthermore, he insisted that the cold of the ground would inevitably rise, seeping into their bones, freezing the blood in their extremities while they slept. He warned her that earth is a tomb. It absorbs heat. It does not generate it. He told her that placing children in a subterranean box was a fundamental violation of architectural sanity. His arguments were sound, based on the construction of above-ground homes. But he completely misunderstood the principle of thermal mass and the closed-loop system Helena was designing. He assumed she intended to build a roaring fire down there. She did not. She let him finish his lecture, thanked him for his concern, and continued to square the corners of her earthen walls. The final objection came not from a place of physics or economics, but from the deep, judgmental heart of frontier society. Mrs. Gable, the wife of the town magistrate, arrived on a Sunday afternoon, her face pinched in a mask of moral outrage. For the women of the settlement, maintaining a semblance of civilized domesticity in the brutal wilderness was a badge of honor. Houses had swept wooden floors, curtains, and whitewashed walls. To dig a hole in the ground and intend to live in it like a badger was, to Mrs. Gable, an absolute surrender to savagery. She stood at the edge of the pit, clutching her shawl, and spoke of the indignity of it all. She declared that poverty was a trial sent to test one's faith, but descending into the mud was a choice that stripped a family of its humanity. She hinted darkly that the town might not allow children to be kept in such conditions, suggesting it was akin to burying them alive before their time. This was the only moment Helena paused in her work. She looked up from the bottom of the 6-foot trench, the heavy clay packed under her fingernails, her face streaked with sweat and dirt. She looked at the polished leather boots of the magistrate's wife, standing on the very surface that would soon be scoured by lethal winds. She did not argue about dignity. She knew that the most undignified thing a mother could do was fail to keep her children warm. As November approached, the air grew brittle. The ground began to harden, making every thrust of the shovel a jarring impact that travelled up her arms and rattled her teeth. The dugout was finally excavated to its full 6-foot depth. Now came the most critical phase of the engineering, the roof and the vapor barrier. This was where the mechanism shifted from a simple hole in the ground to a sophisticated thermal trap. From the mercantile, she had purchased her only major materials, several heavy oiled canvas tarpaulins used for covering freight wagons, and a dozen stout discarded cedar fence posts. She laid the cedar posts horizontally across the top of the trench, creating a slightly pitched framework. Over this, she stretched the oiled canvas tightly, overlapping the edges by over a foot. This canvas was not just a roof. It was an absolute, impenetrable vapor and wind barrier. In a standard wooden cabin, the wind finds every tiny gap, constantly exchanging warm indoor air with freezing outdoor air. The oiled canvas stopped this convection dead, but a thin sheet of canvas provides zero insulation. The genius of the dugout lay in what came next. Helena spent the next 2 weeks shoveling the 30 tons of excavated earth back on top of the canvas. She built the dirt roof up to a thickness of nearly 2 feet. This immense weight of soil served as the ultimate thermal mass. It would absorb the ambient heat from the earth around it and completely isolate the interior from the atmospheric temperature above. Finally, she seeded the thick dirt mound with the prairie grass she had uprooted. When the roots took hold, they would bind the soil together, preventing the wind from eroding her roof. The entrance was a narrow, ramped trench, leading down to a heavy, double-layered wooden trapdoor, insulated with packed straw between the boards. But the true mastery of her design, the detail that prevented the dugout from becoming a damp, suffocating grave, was a single, unassuming piece of vegetation. Before piling the earth onto the canvas, Helena took a hollowed-out stalk of an elderberry bush, about 3 inches in diameter, and secured it vertically through a small hole in the canvas, extending it up through the dirt roof to the open air. This was her passive microvent. It was too small to allow significant heat to escape or wind to enter, but just large enough to allow the moisture from their breath and the trace gases from the lamps to slowly, passively wick away into the atmosphere. It was an exercise in absolute precision. When the first hard freeze locked the landscape in a crust of white frost in early December, the heavy wooden trapdoor closed behind the Bjornson family. The darkness inside was total, heavy, and silent. There was a moment of profound, crushing doubt as Helena struck the match to light the first kerosene lantern. The smell of raw earth was overpowering. The walls were damp to the touch. The space felt infinitely small, pressing in on her from all sides. For a terrifying hour, she sat on the edge of the makeshift bed, watching the shadows dance on the clay walls, wondering if Elias Thorne and Mr. Vance had been right, wondering if she had just sealed herself and her children into a tomb. But then the physics began to work. The human body at rest is a thermal engine, radiating approximately 100 watts of heat energy into its environment. Between Helena and her 2 children, they were constantly generating 300 watts of raw, biological warmth. The 2 kerosene lanterns she kept burning, their wicks trimmed low to prevent smoking, generated roughly 400 watts each. This meant that inside that perfectly sealed, highly insulated 10 by 8 box, there was a constant, steady output of 1100 watts of heat. In a drafty wooden cabin, 1100 watts would be instantly stolen by the wind and the cold walls. But inside the geothermal heat trap, the heat had nowhere to go. The 2 feet of dense earth above them and the solid ground around them acted as an impenetrable blanket. Slowly, imperceptibly at first, the air began to change. The cold, damp edge of the underground air began to soften. The heat from their bodies and the lamps rose, hit the heavy, oiled canvas, and was reflected back down. The earthen walls, starting at their natural baseline of 50 degrees, began to slowly absorb the excess heat, acting as a thermal battery, storing the warmth and radiating it back into the small room. By the 3rd day underground, the mercury thermometer she had hung on a center post stopped creeping upward and settled definitively on the line marking 68 degrees. It did not matter if the wind outside was blowing at 10 miles an hour or 50. It did not matter if the sun was shining or if a blizzard was raging. The interior of the dugout had completely divorced itself from the weather of the surface world. And then came the true test, the event that would shatter the arrogant confidence of the town above. The great Arctic outbreak did not arrive as a gentle snowfall. It struck on the afternoon of February 9th like a physical blow. The sky turned a bruised, sickly purple, and the barometric pressure dropped so rapidly that dogs in the town began to whine in pain. A wall of blinding white, driven by sustained winds of 60 miles per hour, slammed into Blackwood. For the next 3 days, the temperature never rose above negative 30 degrees. At night, it plummeted past negative 40. The wind chill reached a theoretical negative 80 degrees, a temperature at which exposed human flesh freezes solid in under 2 minutes. Up in the town, the nightmare unfolded exactly as the physics of the situation dictated. The immense cold caused the milled lumber of the fine houses to physically contract. Boards shrank, pulling away from their nails, widening the gaps in the siding. The wind, howling with unimaginable force, drove the freezing air through these newly formed cracks like liquid ice. The residents built their fires higher, desperately stuffing massive logs into their stone hearths. But the hotter the fire burned, the stronger the updraft became, and the faster the chimneys sucked the sub-zero air into the rooms. It was a deadly cycle. Families dragged their mattresses directly onto the hearths, huddling together under piles of coats, carpets and blankets, watching their breath form thick clouds of steam mere inches from a blazing fire. Buckets of water froze solid in the kitchens. The elderly and the very young began to suffer terribly as the ambient temperature inside the homes hovered precariously near zero. Panic set in. The wood piles, burning at 3 times the normal rate, began to vanish under the snowdrifts. During the darkest, most violent night of the storm, Elias Thorne, the pragmatist, found himself in a desperate situation. The roof of his expansive general store, heavily loaded with an abnormal accumulation of dense, wind-packed snow, gave a terrifying groan and partially collapsed, sending a shower of freezing white powder and splintered wood into his living quarters. His hearth fire was instantly smothered. Faced with a dwelling that was rapidly equalizing with the deadly temperature outside, he wrapped himself in a heavy buffalo coat, tied a woolen scarf over his face until only his eyes were visible, and forced his way out the door. He intended to reach the magistrate's house, but the wind was a physical wall, pushing him off course, disorienting him in a total whiteout. He stumbled blindly across the frozen prairie, the cold piercing his heavy coat, the freezing air burning his lungs like inhaled glass. His extremities were rapidly losing sensation. He was a man who had calculated everything, and he realized he had miscalculated his own survival. As his legs began to give out, his boot struck something hard beneath the drifting snow. It was a piece of wood. He fell to his knees, sweeping wildly at the snow, his thick gloves brushing against the heavy, straw-insulated trapdoor of Helena Bjornson's dugout. He pounded on the wood with his remaining strength, the sound barely carrying over the roar of the wind. A moment later, the trapdoor lifted slightly, and a sliver of soft yellow light cut through the blinding storm. Hands grabbed the collar of his heavy coat and pulled him downward, out of the chaotic, screaming wind and into the earth. The trapdoor slammed shut above him, and the heavy iron latch was thrown. The transition was so sudden, so violently abrupt, that Elias Thorne fell to his hands and knees on the packed dirt floor, gasping for breath. The wind, which had been deafening a second before, was instantly gone, replaced by an absolute profound silence. He braced himself for the bone-chilling dampness he had predicted, the freezing tomb he had warned Helena about. But as he knelt there in the dim light, his chest heaving, the frost on his eyebrows beginning to melt and drip into his eyes, he felt it. Warmth. Not the harsh, blistering, one-sided heat of a massive fire that left your back freezing while your face burned. It was a gentle, pervasive, encompassing warmth. It was the air itself that was warm. He slowly untied the frozen scarf from his face and unbuttoned his heavy buffalo coat, suddenly feeling stiflingly hot in the heavy gear. He looked up. The small 10-by-8 room was immaculate. The dirt walls were dry and solid. The air smelled faintly of clean kerosene and dried grass, fresh and breathable thanks to the silent, invisible work of the elderberry stem venting through the roof. On the raised bed, the 2 children were sitting up, looking at him with wide eyes, wearing only light cotton nightshirts. Helena stood near the center post, holding a lantern, her face calm, completely unbothered by the apocalyptic event raging just 6 feet above her head. Elias slowly pushed himself up, his eyes drifting to the wooden post in the center of the room. Nailed to the wood was the glass thermometer. He stepped closer, squinting in the lantern light. The thin line of silver mercury rested, unmoving, precisely on the mark for 68 degrees. He stared at it for a long time. The pragmatist, the man who understood the hard numbers of the world, was forced to accept a reality that defied all the expensive, conventional wisdom of the surface. He had laughed at her dirt pit. He had told her she was wasting her energy. He had measured her survival in cords of wood and milled lumber. He had failed to measure the absolute quiet power of the earth itself. "You have no fire," he whispered, his voice hoarse, the first words spoken in the silence of the dugout. Helena looked at him, then looked at her children. "The earth does not need a fire, Mr. Thorne," she replied quietly. "It only needs to be reminded to hold the heat we give it." For the next 2 days, Elias Thorne remained in the dugout, sleeping on the packed dirt floor, wrapped in his coat, listening to the muffled, distant roar of the storm that was tearing the town apart above them. He watched the simple, elegant mechanics of the space. He saw how the heat from the lanterns never escaped, how the heavy canvas kept the air perfectly still, how the deep earth absorbed their warmth and sent it back to them. It was not savagery. It was an engineering masterpiece, born of necessity and executed with an intuitive understanding of physics that the town's expert builders entirely lacked. When the storm finally broke on the morning of February 14th, the silence returned to the prairie. The trapdoor was pushed open, and Helena and Elias climbed up into a transformed world. The landscape was unrecognizable, buried under massive sculpted drifts of hard-packed snow. The temperature was still a bitter 10 degrees below zero, but the deadly wind had ceased. They walked the 2 miles back to Blackwood. The town was a scene of silent devastation. Chimneys had collapsed, roofs had caved in under the weight of the snow. Every single window was heavily frosted over from the inside, a grim testament to the freezing temperatures within the homes. The people who emerged from their expensive mortared cabins were haggard, hollow-eyed, and shivering, wrapped in every piece of fabric they owned. They had survived, but just barely. The toll the cold had taken on them was evident in their slow movements and exhausted faces. They had burned through their entire winter supply of wood in a matter of days, fighting a battle against the wind that they could never win. Mr. Vance, the cabin builder, stood outside his own home, staring at the wide gaps that had opened up between his meticulously joined logs. He watched as Helena Bjornson walked down the center of the snow-choked street, her children trailing behind her, their faces flushed and healthy, completely unbothered by the lingering cold. They did not look like refugees emerging from a frozen tomb. They looked like people who had just woken up from a comfortable sleep in a warm room. The magistrate's wife, Mrs. Gable, watched from her frozen window, her moral certainty shattered by the undeniable visual proof of Helena's success. The savage hole in the ground had proven infinitely superior to the civilized architecture of the town. The narrative of Blackwood changed that spring. When the ground thawed and the snowmelt turned the prairie to mud, no one laughed at the dugout. In fact, when the timber shipments were delayed by the spring floods, Elias Thorne did not attempt to rebuild his collapsed roof. Instead, he hired men to dig a massive deep cellar behind his store, lining it with heavy canvas and packing earth securely over the top. Mr. Vance, the expert builder, quietly began experimenting with earth-bermed walls on the north side of his new cabins, applying the principles of thermal mass that he had witnessed in action. They didn't call it a dirt pit anymore. Decades later, architectural journals would use sophisticated terminology to describe what Helena had done. They would call it earth-sheltered design, passive geothermal heating, and high-mass thermal envelopes. They would draw complex diagrams showing vapor barriers and micro-ventilation systems. But in 1899, it was just a mother with a Swedish steel shovel, an unbreakable will, and the practical intelligence to realize that when nature becomes an unstoppable, freezing force, the only way to win is to step out of the wind and let the earth itself provide the warmth. History is invariably written by those who survive to tell it, and survival is rarely achieved by simply doing what everyone else is doing. It is achieved by those who are willing to look foolish, to dig deeper, and to trust the immutable laws of nature over the fragile comforts of convention. If preserving this kind of forgotten, hard-earned knowledge matters to you, if you believe that true resilience is built from the ground up, subscribe and share this story. The wisdom of the past is the only map we have for the storms of the future.